Turmoil and volatility are at the order of the day. This is Business 7. Welcome to the program. In this edition, we're talking to experts to find out what the state of the Namibian consumer is, what the impact of rising inflation and forecasted runaway inflation will be locally, and to which extent government can help. Also in the program, we will look at the International Monetary Fund's latest global world growth forecast and also reflect on what their expectations are for Namibia.
Connection. It's in the human touch, the feeling of belonging. It inspires us and empowers us, creates clarity from complexity. It starts new conversations, unlocks the power of advice, and makes an impact on your life. At Alex Forbes, we pioneer insight to provide you with advice that connects your decisions of today to your impact tomorrow.
Salomo Hay is a local economist, and we contacted him to ask him what the state of the Namibian consumer is and to sketch the background of why we found ourselves in the predicament that we are currently. Welcome to the studio, Salomo Hay. He's a Namibian economist. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and good day to your viewers.
Mr. Hay, we know the background around the whole turmoil with inflation, food inflation, transport inflation, etc. That is extremely alarming. But just put into a nutshell for us, what is the current state of the consumer in Namibia?
So, consumer spending has really driven the Namibian economy. And when I say consuming, I'm making reference to household expenditure. Now, what has happened at the advent of COVID, consumers and households were under huge pressure. You know that we lost quite a few jobs precisely because of the pandemic, and that sort of dealt with the spending patterns and the reliance of household expenditure on our economy. So what then transpired is we then went into supply disruptions, which meant that the availability of goods and services that households consume were not as readily available as before COVID. So what that then did was increase prices for goods and services. It meant that where we were paying 3 Namibian dollars for an onion or potato, we were paying twice the price because of the unavailability of these essentials for households. Now, what you had then, you also had commodity, an increase in commodity prices, and specifically oil. And remember, this was before the current crisis between Ukraine and Russia. So we had an increase in prices for the basic commodities, which are the basic commodities, which are the essentials for households. We then had an input in an increase in important components of household consumption, which is fuel. So you link that to the general declining economic environment. So you had a double whammy where consumers were under huge pressure. Consumers' disposable income were eroded, and the money that consumers had could not fetch them the necessary basket of goods and services that they could sort of afford before COVID. So they had less money in their pockets for less goods that they could access. So essentially, it has been a huge burden on consumers. Now, what subsequently transpired as we were moving towards some level of recovery or bringing the pandemic under control, there was support from some fiscal policy intervention and obviously some monetary policy relaxation. So what happened was the advanced economies started intervening directly in their economies. There was an asset purchasing program that was aggressively carried out by the advanced economies. So what that meant is that there was liquidity put into the economy to be able to deal with the supply disruption and the general declining economic environment globally. So that led to further inflationary, especially where you have the current global inflation in the West, specifically the US and the Euro area, is perhaps at its highest level in over years. So there's a global inflationary environment, and we're paying more for goods and services than at any other point in time. Now, what we also know is that we import quite a bit of its goods and services, and so we subsequently also import our inflation. What then transpired is the central banks obviously needed to rein in this inflation that's growing at an alarm. So again, households had to feel further burden in terms of the increase in interest rates. You know that is linked is pegged to the rent, and subsequently our interest rate cycle follows the South African interest rate cycle closely. So an increase in interest rate meant that consumers or households then, on top of the inflationary environment where they were paying more for less goods and services, they then also now have to pay more for their installments. And when I say more for their installments, I actually mean those that are currently in one form or the other have got an obligations with the financial sector or banks specifically. So if you have an installment with any of the banks or hire purchase or mortgage, it meant that because of the inflationary increase, central banks and specifically the Bank of Namibia is now dealing with that increase in inflation to be able to rein in the inflation. And remember, the current inflation is a combination of COVID, which is then obviously the supply disruptions. Now, what we are feeling is that the crisis in Ukraine and Russia obviously makes that worse. Supply side. Now, as the economies globally recover, you would have demand side inflation as well. Now, the South African Reserve Bank have got a mandate which is referred to as inflation targeting. And that inflation targeting means that inflation should remain between the 3 and 6% band. And so the supply disruptions, obviously, and all the other related issues that we alluded to, means that by the time the economy recover, they want to be ahead of the curve, and that's why they have embarked on interest rate cycle increase for the next 3 years. And what this means is that consumers remain severely constrained because of the concoction of events and dynamics that that it's unfolding in the global, the continent and the sub-region, and obviously Namibia by extension.
That's quite a gloomy picture you're painting there, Mr. Hay. How serious is the impact of the latest development, and how bad do you expect the inflation rate to get?
Well, inflation will remain alleviated in the short to medium term, in my view, and it will be alleviated because of the supply side dynamics that we are currently seeing. The situation is quite dire because for an economy like Namibia that's highly reliant on household expenditure, this will mean that we would not have the swift recovery that one would have wanted to see because of the inflationary pressures. But what we also know is that we will not be in this position indefinitely. We anticipate that at some point the economy needs to recover. And what then would happen is that there could be another wave of inflationary components coming in, but this time being driven by the demand factors. And the demand factors would mean that as part of the recovery, you would have more people perhaps moving into jobs, and subsequently they would have access to, you would have more hands having access to disposable income, and subsequently chasing more goods, which is actually, in my view, the expected inflationary that one want to see in any economy, because it means that it's demand driven. And that will obviously translate in economic growth if it were. So the long and short of it really is that we are going to see two waves of inflationary. Obviously, the current one that we are in is in the main being driven on the side. And once we move towards the recovery phase, which I anticipate could really be towards next year, mid next year, for the Namibian economy. Remember that the recovery that we have posted now is in the main driven by the base effect, which means that we are coming from an extremely low base, and it's what we refer to as a statistical correction. The current growth for this year, which is 2022, again have been revised downward, not only in Namibia but globally. So the sort of organic growth that we want to see take root, in my view, I think will only start feeling that towards mid next year. And we really hope that we can take advantage of that by moving towards comparative sectors. And comparative sectors, I mean sectors where Namibia enjoys a certain level of advantage and can employ and labor intensive sectors, agriculture and the SME. What is quite encouraging as well, and I think is worth me here, is that the governor of the Bank of Namibia has now sort of come out and made the point that the current spread between the repo and the prime is potentially too high, and it means that relief could come through there if we sort of start looking at the SMEs differently, and through that we anticipate that recovery could come in. But for all intents and purposes, where we find ourselves is an extremely between a rock and a hard place.
While Namibia and its cities are seen as one of the cleanest countries in Africa, plastic pollution is a big problem. Therefore, it's up to each of us to do what we can to reduce the use of plastic, especially single-use plastic bags. At Liberty Life Namibia, we've taken the decision to turn all our old branding items into reusable shopping bags. It's a way in which we can drive sustainability and look after our most important stakeholder, our environment. If you also believe in sustainability and would like more information, please get in touch. Liberty Life Namibia. In it with you.
Who will come to the aid of the consumer? Does government have the power or the fiscal space to move to help the consumer? Solomon Hay elaborates. Indeed, we are. Mr. Hay, we know that these developments hurt the most vulnerable the most. Is there anything that government can or should do to alleviate the situation?
Well, what we do know is that obviously the vulnerable, for instance, uses public transport. And what we also know that the increase in public transport means that they are paying more for transport, further erodes their disposable income. We also know that the essential commodities and soft commodities like food, for instance, and specifically maize meal and wheat, which is obviously bread and all of that. These are what the vulnerable consume on a daily basis, and they have also gone up from a pricing perspective. So what we do know now is that there's an assessment in South Africa around the fuel model that they currently apply that side. And obviously the fuel levy speaks to how much we pay or how much South African consumers pay at the pump price. We also know that our fuel prices are generally lower than South African if you do a person, because obviously we are also highly subsidized currently. But obviously we know now that that subsidization sort of needs to be reviewed in terms of looking at the new dynamics that have come to fore, especially in relation to how much we are paying for fuel, of looking at it to say what is the level of subsidization or review that could be initiated for us to start looking at those developments and how they impact the most vulnerable and indigent households.
Mr. Hay, we're running out of time, so as a final question, I'd like to ask you whether you have any tips for consumers on how to curb this runaway train.
Well, I think really it's an issue, like I indicated earlier, is that we are between a rock and a hard place. Namibia is not the only country that's experiencing these challenges. in the economy. It's a global phenomenon. One would want to encourage consumers to really focus on the essentials as much as they can, and really try and keep within the confines of their spending budgets, because anything outside of that could have dire consequences. What we also know is that there's a need to really consider moving towards entrepreneurship to the extent that we borrow certain lessons from the East African countries like amongst others, and how vibrant those sectors, the SME sector has been, and through that try and have an additional income, because jobs are hard to come by, and they will be hard to come by in the short term. And obviously we have got expenditures, we've got obligations, and. So tighten your belts as much as you can. It's starting to sound like a broken record. I think we need to try what we can during these difficult times, and keep to your spending patterns and make sure that you focus on your essentials. For now, we can leave the luxury goods until when the cycle turns, and keep to the basics.
Mr. Hay, thank you very much for your insights, and have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to your viewers.
The International Monetary Fund yesterday released its latest global economic outlook, and in it forecasts growth for Namibia for 2022 at a 2.8%. This is considerably lower than the 3.4% the Bank of Namibia currently expects the economy to grow. Now, the IMF also doesn't foresee great growth for Namibia in the medium term. They are forecasting at this stage a growth rate of 2.5% by 2027. Thank you very much for joining Business 7. We're playing out with a video of the IMF looking at its latest global economic forecast. We'll see you again next week, the same time, the same place.